Episode 71. Let's settle a score on number 71, Evgeny Malkin, who is a member of the Pittsburgh Penguins Mount Rushmore. He's won the Calder, Hart, Art Ross, and Conn Smythe trophies. He has the most assists by a Russian-born player with 798. He's averaged 1.13 points per game in the regular season. That's more than Alex Ovechkin, by the way. A point per game in the playoffs, and he has 3 Stanley Cup rings. Without a doubt, in the top 100 players to ever lace it up. Beyond MD, episode 71, here we go! Hey everyone, welcome back to the Beyond MD podcast. Last weekend, I had a chance to attend the Physician Empowerment Conference as a panelist, and I want to say that I had a chance to talk to some of my physician colleagues for the very first time. I know a lot of you have been supporting me on my journey these last 4 years with the podcast, and I just want to say that some of the feedback I received last weekend was deeply meaningful for me. You guys, the listeners, have given me a boost on so many occasions, and you all keep the podcast going. So a deep thank you from me. I'm really excited for today's interview, which features international best-selling author Andrew Hallam. This is a truly wide-ranging conversation, one that I've been looking forward to for so long. We talk about the pillars behind a successful life, the relationship between money and happiness, home ownership and happiness, how to spend money in a way so that we enhance life satisfaction. We also talk about evidence-based investing and doing so in a frictionless way so that we can enjoy the things that truly matter in life. And I also pick Andrew's brain on the lessons he's learned when it comes to purpose and relationships and what he's learned living abroad. So with that, enjoy my conversation with Andrew Hallam. Hey everyone, so today is an amazing day. So I'm joined by Andrew Hallam, who is international best-selling author. I think that most of you will already know Andrew and his work, but for those of you who don't, he's written some phenomenal books. So Millionaire Teacher, Millionaire Expat, and then the one book that really changed the way that I look at my life. And it's more than just beyond money, but that book is called Balance. So Andrew, thank you for putting all of your good work out to the world and having such an impact that you have. And welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Yatin. I really appreciate that.
So, Andrew, I think the way you live your life is really, really interesting. So before we get started into the core topic, can you just tell us where you are recording from today?
In Boquete, Panama. So it's a small town that's not too far from Costa Rica, but it's in the mountains. And I met a guy recently who said to me, paradise is anywhere in the tropics at 1,000 meters of elevation. And I kind of get that because, where we are, if you go down to the coast, which is only about a 45-minute drive, it's crazy hot.
Yeah.
But here at night, it gets down to 17 degrees Celsius. And then during the day, it gets up to about 26 or 27. So for me, it's an absolute sweet spot. I love it. So spending a lot of time in here since January and doing a lot of time riding my bike and hiking in the mountains. It's been really, really cool.
Andrew, that sounds amazing. And maybe you could just tell us a bit about how do you spend your time now? Because I imagine you are a fairly sought after speaker. I know you educate a lot of people and even companies when it comes to finances and beyond that. But how do you tend to spend your time now?
It's not as routine as perhaps it should be for overall effectiveness. I think in terms of getting things done, we end up moving around a lot. And you mentioned that, so I do a fair amount of speaking. Sometimes it's more than other times. And so, in just last month, we were in Luxembourg where I was speaking there. Next month, we'll be in Barcelona. I'll be speaking there. And we usually try to, with the speaking engagements, we usually try and tag on some kind of holiday. And one of the great things about this is we've been to places that we never would have expected and enjoyed places that we never would have expected. So that's been a really cool sort of addition to what for us is already a really adventurous lifestyle because we've been nomadic since 2014. So I met my wife in Singapore. We were both school teachers there. So I taught high school English and high school personal finance, and she taught high school Spanish. We thought we'd take a year off just to travel. And 1 year has led to 10. And so we're still going. So we often rent a place for a few months at a time, and it could be at different countries, and we sort of float around, and sometimes those speaking engagements draw us, as I mentioned, to places that we never would have expected to go to.
I think what an amazing way to see the world. And your background, you originally grew up in Canada?
Yeah, I was born in England, and then my parents emigrated to Canada when I was 3.
Okay.
So I grew up in. I was spent my school days in Kamloops, British Columbia, and then my family moved to Victoria about a year after I graduated from high school. So
Okay.
my family actually lives in Victoria now.
Oh, very nice. Can I ask, where were you born in England? Because I was born in England as well. I was born in Ashford in Kent, and then when I was 1, we moved to Canada.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
born in Nottingham.
Oh, okay, very cool. So, Andrew, let's get into balance. So, you kind of talk about balance in your book as this stool that has 4 legs, and all 4 legs are very, very important, equally important. Maybe give us a breakdown of what balance is, like what's this requisite to a satisfying life, and then we can pick away at it.
It's how I defined what success is. And so I defined it as like a four-legged table. So you have one leg is the money leg. So we do need a degree of money, obviously, to have life satisfaction. The second leg is relationships, arguably the most important. So we need our relationships to be solid. A third leg is health. And the fourth leg is a sense of purpose. And so for me, people aren't successful unless they have a pretty good balance of those 4 aspects. And many people would look at something like success very conventionally, and they'll think success is career and it's money in the bank. But if you're jeopardizing one of those legs, the health leg or the relationship leg, usually people have got a sense of purpose if they're driven to have more and and work their way up corporate ladders. But often, if we jeopardize the relationship leg, then it affects our overall life satisfaction. And when you ask people why they want to be successful in the first place, whatever their definition is, ultimately, if you keep asking why, they'll say, well, I want to be happy. I want life satisfaction. So the idea for balance came about as me really looking at this quite holistically and redefining success and hoping in a way that I could give some perspective or loan some perspective so that people could see this through a different lens in ways that in some cases perhaps they weren't maximizing life satisfaction because they were overemphasizing one of those legs over the other.
So, is it safe to say then, in your experience, because this is how it's worked for me and a lot of the people I talk to, but that financial leg or maybe that career leg maybe gets a bit too much attention, and then it's that relationship leg that's often compromised?
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. It's ironic. I mentioned some research in balance. It was done 136 country research on life satisfaction relative to income. So people were asked to rate their overall life satisfaction, and then that was essentially put up against, well, what was their actual income level for each of those individuals. And Richard Easterlin first did research on this in the 1970s. It's called the
Mm-hmm.
Easterlin paradox, and
Mm-hmm.
it's such that life satisfaction does increase with income, but only to a certain point. So beyond that point, there's what's called association level.
Mm-hmm.
And far beyond that, there's an actual downward movement. And so, regardless of the region, whether it was the Middle East or Africa or Central America, South America, North America, Europe, regardless of the region in Asia, it was all the same. And that there was an actual income level where once that was actually achieved, life satisfaction actually dropped. Yet so many of us, and so many of us are aspiring for more to enhance our life satisfaction. And often that's more income. But as a result of that, Yatin, as you mentioned, as you were alluding to, it typically comes at the expense of something else. And so it's not to say that there aren't really high income people who earn $1 million a year plus who are really satisfied. But they're generally really satisfied if they have those 4 legs operating effectively together. So if they focus far too much on career and they jeopardize their relationships or their health, they're not going to have a high level of life satisfaction. And often, when we see this research, one of the reasons we see this downward movement with respect to a certain income level and beyond that income level,
Mm-hmm.
the downward movement in life satisfaction, is that those jobs tend to require large amounts of time pressure, and that time is usually time that they take away from relationships and their health.
That is a perfect segue into what I was about to ask. My first question for you is going to be, Andrew, like, what is some of the evidence behind income and happiness? And I think you've answered it entirely there. That's really, really good. My sense was that as you earn more, I thought it was going to be more a scenario of diminishing returns. Like, you continue to get happy as you earn more income, but each increase in income doesn't result in that same jump in happiness. But you've actually explained that beyond a certain point, probably because of the time that it takes up, people who make too much are maybe less happy. I want to kind of move on to, how should we be thinking about spending our money? Like, you've talked about in your book about spending on experiences. Yet I still find that, and this happens to us all the time, but other people too, but we spend on materials. And I can tell you that 2020, 2021, like, I would be coming home every day during the pandemic, and most days there would actually be an Amazon box like at our doorstep. And I was just like, okay, what's going on here? I was like, maybe it's just like a Monday, Wednesday phenomenon, but Thursday came, Friday came, there was another box at the doorstep. And my theory is, Andrew, I've tried to dig into this and talk to people, but maybe it's related to a bit of a dopamine hit. Maybe when we buy something, we feel really good. We get that transient jump in dopamine, but then that's very fleeting. It doesn't last very long. Our dopamine falls and we seek that next dopamine hit. Maybe this is why we continue to buy things rather than experiences. I'm curious if you have a take on this, and then maybe talk to us about what should we strive to spend our money on.
Well, material acquisitions, to your point, are like it's like ingesting sugar. So there's an immediate high, and you've had that sugar, you've had that chocolate, whatever it is. But then what happens is there's something called hedonic adaptability, where we simply just get used to that new item. You can think about it as, even kids with Christmas. And so, listeners, if you have children, you've seen this with your children. If you don't have children, you could probably recall this yourself, where there's this thing you've been pining for forever, you've been begging your parents for, and you hope Santa's going to deliver it. And then, wow, Santa delivers it. It's under the Christmas tree, and you're super excited. You unwrap it and you play with it for whatever, a day or two, a week, 2 weeks. But before long, it just sits in a corner somewhere and it collects dust. You've gotten used to the novelty of that item. And that's how human beings are wired. And that's why when you look at, say, even people with high-end automobiles like BMWs and Jags and Mercedes-Benzes, the research suggests that they aren't any happier with their vehicles than people that drive secondhand Toyotas, Hondas, Hyundais. We simply get used to whatever it is that we own. So we're super excited. We get a brand new BMW. We're really jazzed. We're driving it. We're very excited, but pretty soon it no longer excites us to the same degree. It just becomes that thing that will get us from point A to point B. And now the risk is your neighbor just got a brand new Maserati. You've had your BMW for a year. It no longer gives you the charge it used to. Your neighbor's got that Maserati and your neighbor looks pretty happy. So, it's one of those things. It's that hedonic treadmill. We actually don't know. Daniel Kahneman, the late behavioral psychologist and Nobel Prize winner in behavioral economics, said that we don't really know what will make us happy. Mm-hmm. And it seems such a strange thing to say. What do you mean we don't know what will make us happy? Well, the reality is we don't, especially when it comes to material acquisitions, because material acquisitions do not make us happier unless it has a way of bringing people together. So there are a couple of, as with anything, there are going to be nuances. Mm-hmm. And when we look at material acquisitions, okay, we know intellectually, wait a second. Intellectually, we know if material acquisitions truly made us happier, then people with the most stuff would be singing the most in the showers. Mm-hmm. They'd be laughing the most, they'd be giggling the most, they'd be telling the most jokes, they'd be smiling the most. But we know that isn't true. Like, we know it. So we know it on an intellectual level. But do we know it on a behavioral level? Well, that doesn't apply to me. Well, wait a second. No, it does. One of the nuances, Yacht, and I believe, is that if you're going to purchase something that allows you to fulfill a passion, to do something you've never done before with other people. So if that's something that can bring people together, and like, let's say it's a lake house and your family's been saving for a lake house, and that lake house brings all the other families together. And many people have this example where they think about a family member who may have had a cottage on the lake, and it just brings people together where you're playing in the water, you're there every summer. That's a material acquisition that enhances relationships. Does it enhance relationships? And enhance relationships, that in itself, whatever enhances relationship, has a huge component on life satisfaction. But generally speaking, material acquisitions are generally just like ingesting sugar.
I love it. I totally agree with that. Now, can you also talk about your desert island litmus test? I found this to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you did. Again, when it comes down to the nuance, I mean, so nothing is always, black and white. There's a lot of gray. So, we have research on this where obviously there are going to be people that say to me, they're listening to this and they're going to say, Andrew, that's bunk. I have a real passion for German engineering. And I really, really appreciate the Porsche that I own. I've got a 911. I'm super excited about it. I so appreciate just the feel of the Porsche, the acceleration, the tightness, and the novelty never wears off for me. And I say, okay, great. That might be true, but let's present the deserted island litmus test to see if you actually do pass that test. So that is something where we ask the question, would you buy it or would you still own it if nobody else could see it? And I think that's a great test for would you buy it if nobody else could see it. So if you lived on a deserted island by yourself, would you still buy that Porsche 911? If the answer is yes, you'd still buy it even if no one could see it, then you are buying it for the right reason. But more often than not, when it comes to a material acquisition, a luxury acquisition especially, when we ask people that question and they're really honest with the answer, more often than not, they say, geez, you know what? If I'm being really honest, if nobody else could see it, I probably wouldn't buy it. Now, herein lies another layer of irony, Yatin, because do we love people anymore who have better cars than us?
No. Right? It doesn't make me think any differently of that individual because they have a car. Like, not at all. So I can see where this is going.
Yeah, in some cases, it even evokes irony.
Yeah, totally. Okay, one thing I do want to pick your brain on is home ownership. And I can tell you that I don't want to open up the can of worms of, is a home a good investment or not? But I want to talk more about the evidence of is home ownership, is that associated with happiness? I could tell you why we have a home. We have it for stability. Like, I want to have control over the roof over my head. But otherwise, I would be pretty happy renting. In fact, there's a really interesting book called The Wealthy Renter, and they kind of compare different scenarios of individual A who rents and just invests whatever is left over into the markets for the long term versus somebody who buys a home. I know rents have gone up now, but I want to ask you about the evidence behind home ownership. Does that equate to more happiness? Because in Canada, we seem to be a nation of like aspiring homeowners everywhere. I'd love your take on this.
I think that when it comes to home ownership, first of all, a home is not an investment. So if you own a piece of real estate and you're residing in it, it's not an investment. It's an investment in your lifestyle. It's an investment in something that you want for you and or your family, but it's not a financial investment. A second home and a third home, those are financial investments because you have to live somewhere. So basically, home ownership is just secured shelter. That's how I see it. And so much of this now comes down to you as an individual. So we are all different. I am very comfortable not owning a home. I have owned a home in the past, but I don't currently own one. And I'm very, very comfortable with that. I think that a lot of people will just copy what others do. It becomes norms set by the people around you.
Mm-hmm.
In Germany, for example, a very small percentage of people in Germany own their own home. And we know that Germans, by and large, are just as financially successful as Canadians are. No more, no less. They have a perfectly adequate first world lifestyle. Yet very few of them actually own their own homes. And that becomes for them a norm. And I think that we can end up falling victim to falling into a pattern of following what we think the norm is. I don't think that we necessarily need to have a home in order to feel life satisfaction. People in Germany, I doubt, feel lower levels of life satisfaction than people in Canada because most Germans don't actually own their own properties. But again, I think it comes down to us asking that question internally, asking that question of ourselves and looking at, what do we really want? Is this really important for our own psychological well-being? And in some people's cases, it will be.
Mm-hmm.
Just to know that no one can ask them to move. You know, you're raising a family in your home, in a home that you're renting. There's always that fear that the owner will say, look, Yatin, you've got to go. So sorry, we're putting the house up to the market, or we're moving into that house.
Mm-hmm.
And that has a value as well. But in terms of the investment quotient, if you own your own home and you sell it, you think you've made lots of money, but then you have to live somewhere. So what are you going to do? Buy the house across the street? It too has gone up in value. So you haven't really made money off a primary residence unless you perhaps move to some tiny small town where the economy's in the dumps and the houses are really, really cheap.
I'd love to ask you, like, what impact do our neighbors have on our level of happiness? Because I think you mentioned this in balance. You know, you can look next door, you can see some of the things that your neighbors may be acquiring, and maybe that's going to force a lot of people to follow suit. Whereas if you live in a neighborhood where people really just prioritize, you know, waving to the person on the sidewalk, interacting, you know, that can result in real meaningful happiness, and you're not acquiring things to try and keep up with other people. I'd love your take on this, because you've talked about it, and many others in my circle have as well. But what impact do neighbors have?
You know, where I first thought I saw this anecdotally before looking
Mm-hmm.
into the research was in India. So I'd go into these mountains in India where people were very, very poor. And there was still a lot of laughter in the villages. And these people were poor. Then I would go to a city in India and I would see equally poor people, but there's a difference. Less laughter. And in their case, the odd Mercedes Benz would drive by. And I think what it is it's our innate need. It's almost a need for us to make comparisons and to look to see how we're doing relative to someone else. And there's a study that I referenced in the book Balance. It was a UK-based study on health relative to income. It was relative to your neighbor's income. And this I found most fascinating, because the gist of it was this. If you earned £100,000 a year and you were living in a neighborhood where most of the others earned 100,000, 110,000, 90,000, your life satisfaction was far higher and your health was far higher than if you earned £300,000 a year but lived in a neighborhood where everybody else was earning £500,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
That I thought was so fascinating. We are so primal in our whatever it is, something within us that will want to, or whether we want to or not, subconsciously, we make these comparisons. So one of the worst things we can do for both our health and our life satisfaction is extend ourselves financially to move into a swanky neighborhood where we're among the lower wage earners. In fact, in cases, if you can do the opposite, this is better for your health and your life satisfaction. So not to suggest that you move into a really sketchy neighborhood that's not safe. I'm not saying that. But there are some wonderful, like most people, there are some wonderful neighborhoods that we could move into where we are, perhaps slightly above average in terms of our income level.
I think that's really, really powerful. The evidence you just shared and that story about India. I'm from India. My family is, and I've never thought about it that way. But I think that's fascinating. Last question on home ownership, Andrew. A lot of people will ask. It's an individual situation, obviously, but can I afford this home? How much should I be spending on a house? And there was one physician in the U.S. known as the white coat investor, and he still educates people on personal finance to date. But he used to have a rule of thumb. I think it was something like try not to spend more than, or your mortgage shouldn't be ideally more than twice your annual household income. Now, with cost of living rising in many, many centers, depending on where you live, I think that rule is really hard to follow. But if people ask you this question, like to avoid being house poor, is there a certain rule of thumb that we should abide by in terms of how much house should we be buying?
Yeah, that's such a tough one. I mean, my mom gave me some advice that I thought was really good. I bought a piece of property when I was in my 20s. It was an oceanfront property, and it was vacant land. And my mom said to me, could you still afford the payments if the interest rate were doubled?
Mm-hmm.
And she set that as the acid test, because in Canada, interest rates can double. In the United States, this is the funny thing, and a lot of Americans don't, a lot of Canadians don't know this. You could get a mortgage at, let's say, last few years ago at 3%, and that mortgage rate will stay at 3% for the duration of the mortgage term. So the mortgage term could be 25 years. So in Canada, every 5 years, we renegotiate, or sometimes every 10 years. But in the United States, you could just get that low mortgage that would just last the duration. But in Canada, we have to be careful. And so that thing that my mom had said to me, it did seem to make, for me, a lot of sense. And I remember thinking that was an important sort of rule of thumb for me.
That's great advice by your mom, I think. Now, Andrew, let's move on to the investing piece, because I think you seem to talk about in your work that if you simplify the investing process, I think you mentioned in balance, if you're spending more than an hour a year thinking about this, it might not be the best use of your time. And I think that if we simplify it, then we can spend our time doing other meaningful things. But one chart in your book of balance was really, really caught my attention. And in fact, I showed it to my wife this morning because we're kind of talking about, well, how do we put money to work for our kids? And it was that chart of rolling 30-year returns. I think you had mentioned think really long term. So can you kind of talk about some of the evidence behind why should we be thinking in a 30-year returns if we have that time horizon?
Yeah, and most of us have that time horizon. First of all, I'll start by saying that. And so some of you may be listening to this and saying, what are you talking about, Andrew? I'm 50 years old. I don't have 30 more years to have my money invested. Well, actually, you do, statistically speaking, because your investment duration isn't your working duration. Your investment duration is your lifetime. So if you are 65 and you hope to live to 95, you have a 30-year investment duration. And that's how we need to think about everything in terms of 30-year terms. And I'll explain why. The biggest enemy to your investment performance is not the markets. The markets are super crazy resilient. I'll give you an example. The worst 30-year period in history started in 1929. So if we take the US stock market from 1929 and we go forward 30 years, and okay, so I'm going to most of you are very familiar with what happened in 1929. There was a big market crash. What you might not be as familiar with is how far the markets fell. So they fell 87%. I mean, after a drop like that, you need to gain about 670% just to break even after an 87% drop. So it was horrific. But anyone who was calm, if they had broad exposure to the US stock market, for example, they could have had a whole litany of blue chip stocks, or in today's day and age, an index fund. Over the 30 years from 1929 forward, they would have averaged 8.26%.
Mm-hmm.
So they would have turned a $10,000 investment into about $112,000 over that 30-year duration. Now, not thinking in 30-year terms is actually the greatest hazard to our future wealth, because we get influenced by the noise. And what I mean by that is we get influenced by how the markets are performing, or how have they performed this week, this year, over the last 5 years, who is saying what on television about where markets are headed, what are people saying about the economy, and how may that not affect the markets. That's noise. There's sort of a joke that the best investors are those who are dead,
Mm-hmm.
or have forgotten that they even had an investment account.
Yeah.
I call it a joke because it's something that a Fidelity employee actually ended up repeating, and we haven't had true verification of that. But what we have had verification of is the less people do with their investment accounts, in terms of the more they move things around based on speculation, the worse they perform. Think of it as like a bar of soap in the shower. The more you mess around with that bar of soap in the shower, the smaller it generally gets. And that's not to mean that your investments won't still grow over 30 years, but you'll likely underperform somebody else by 2, 3, maybe 4% of the year, somebody else who just essentially leaves that bar of soap alone.
Andrew, you wrote another interesting piece more recently. I think it was titled, well, should you invest now or should you wait? And I think that for a lot of people who are newer to the space, there is some fear about, oh my goodness, if I invest now, what if the markets drop right after I invest? That's why I'm scared. So can you talk to us about some of the evidence behind solving that decision, invest now or wait? It's a common question.
Yeah, so when I started to invest, the markets were at an all-time high. And 2 years later, they hit another all-time high, and 3 years later, another. That's what markets do. Markets go on to hit all-time highs if we own a globally diversified exposure to the world's stock markets. So knowing that on average, the markets move up 2 out of every 3 years, the idea of actually holding back when markets hit an all-time high, because we hope at some point that the markets will pull back, is and can be a fool's errand. Because markets actually, after hitting all-time highs, typically end up to perform better over the following 1, 3, 5-year periods than they do during 1, 3, 5-year periods after which markets haven't hit an all-time high. So the idea here is that the markets are totally unpredictable, but all-time highs are normal. Markets will continue to hit all-time highs. Yes, they will drop, but it's best not to try to speculate. In terms of getting money in the markets, for every 5 years that you wait, and this was the gist, Yatin, of that article, where I recalled something Charles Schwab once said. He said, for every 5 years that you wait before starting to invest, you'll have to invest twice as much each month. And I thought, well, that's crazy. Let me see if this is actually true. So I back tested a series of 5-year scenarios, rolling 5-year scenarios back to about 1970. So I back tested that for a globally diversified portfolio of about 70% global stocks and about 30% global bonds. And that I found on average, waiting 5 years meant that 5 years later, you had to invest on average about 72% more money every month.
Holy smokes. Okay.
There was no 5-year period. There was no 5-year period where it was actually beneficial to wait. That didn't exist. So even if you took, and in that article, I gave an example of the year 2000. And so what many people know is that from the year 2000, we had a big drop. So there was the dot-com bubble, and it brought down the prices of so many stocks. So we had a big drop, 2000 to 2003, and the markets sort of worked their way back up again to 2007. And then in 2008, the markets dropped again to the point where over a 10-year period from 2000 to 2010, including reinvested dividends, if you measured it,
Mm-hmm.
the markets didn't make any money. So one of the things people might say is, wait a second, what if I were in a time machine and I was presented with January 2000, would I start my investment journey then?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, you should. And I explained how and why. If you'd started in 2005, you'd need to invest about 86% more every month
Wow.
to have
Holy
the same
smokes.
amount of money that you have today.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily how the markets perform either, because we can pay a lower than average price
Mm-hmm.
when we add money to the markets whenever we have it. So if I had a big lump sum, if I inherited $1 million today, well, Monday the markets are open. It's Sunday right now for me. I would invest it right away. I wouldn't look at the markets. I
Okay.
wouldn't care. And then anytime I had extra money, keep adding.
Okay, that was going to be my next question. So for people, so that they can take the friction out of investing and they can spend their time in more meaningful ways, you would opt for lump sum investing, like basically any day of the year over dollar cost averaging. Is that what I'm getting?
If you have a lump sum, absolutely
Yeah.
invest it. So that's not to say that what I'll do is I'll wait, put money in a savings account. When
Mm-hmm.
it gets to a certain amount, I've got a lump sum. Now
Mm-hmm.
I'll invest it. That's not to say that at all. It's to say when you have money, invest it as soon as you have it. If you have no money,
Mm-hmm.
then adding money monthly, dollar cost averaging, is what you need to do. If for some reason you have $100,000 laying around, or you've just inherited a bunch of money, invest it as soon as you can. So
Okay.
the research on this suggests that 67% of the time, 68% of the time, you'll end up with, let's say someone has $1 million. They got $1 million inheritance and they just put a lump sum into the markets and they leave it. Versus someone that says, ooh, markets are at an all-time high. What I'm going to do is I'm going to split this money up and I'm going to add it quarterly or
Mm-hmm.
monthly
Mm-hmm.
over a period of 2 or 3 years. About 68% of the time, you would have made more money with the lump sum up front. And remember that this whole notion or barometer of, well, markets are at an all-time high, so I'm going to wait. Now is going to be one of those times where I'm going to need to wait. Not when you look at the data on what happens to the markets typically after hitting all-time highs. They typically go on to continue hitting all-time highs. So the rule of thumb here is invest as soon as you have the money. Ignore whatever happens to your portfolio over the next week or month or
Mm-hmm.
quarter or year, and think only in 30-year terms. That's the only term that is relevant to anyone.
I realize people may think we're talking a lot about investing right now. And I know that this podcast is supposed to be more on kind of investing in happiness, but I guess what we are trying to get at is investing with more ease, less friction to make this process really, really automatic. So in that spirit, Andrew, is it safe to assume that you are a fan of investing approaches like these one-stop shop ETFs, for example, through BlackRock and Vanguard, or maybe even a robo-advisor where somebody can just have automatic payments without thinking about it? Are you generally a fan of these simple approaches?
Yes, definitely, because the research supports that either of those two approaches, actually help our behavior with respect to investing. So I'll give you an
Mm-hmm.
example.
Mm-hmm.
You could take any mutual fund you want over a period of time, or index fund for that matter. And let's say that you find there's an index, and let's say it's a Canadian stock market index. And let's say that over the last decade, you see on Morningstar that after fees, the return on that index was, I'm just going to make this up, but let's say it was 8%. Now, Morningstar, what they do is they do a cash flow analysis on investment funds,
Mm-hmm.
which means they look at the money that has gone into the fund at certain times, come out of the fund at certain times. And through that, they actually estimate how investors performed in that same fund. So
Mm-hmm.
if the Toronto Stock Exchange, if an index of Canadian stocks, if it averaged 8% over a 10-year period,
Mm-hmm.
if humans were rational, over that 10-year period, everyone who was invested in that particular index would have earned about an 8% return because that's the return of the index.
Mm-hmm.
However, people aren't rational. We often add more money after markets rise. We add less after markets drop. We move our money around thinking we're being smart and strategic. But generally, most people will underperform the very fund they own by about 2% per year.
Wow, that's significant.
Which
Yeah.
is massive.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's massive. And they won't always do it. So usually what will happen is the markets are moving up. People behave very well when markets move up. And when markets move down, that's when they misbehave. So that's when you start to see these huge gaps. And these huge gaps, if there's a long-term 2% lag, that really can be the difference between you having a retirement portfolio of 600,000 or $1 million. So it's a really big deal. Now, back to your point when you mentioned all-in-one portfolio funds. So Vanguard's assessment or Morningstar's assessment on all-in-one funds that were really first introduced by Vanguard. So around just about 20 years ago, 2004, they were called target retirement funds. And it's basically a single fund that includes a bunch of stock market indexes within it. And when people have one of those, the research suggests that they do less speculation. They just add whatever they have to their portfolio. It's only one fund, but within it, they have full global exposure. And as a result of that, it does something to human behavior. It makes us speculate less, such that when we look at the results of people who own, say, an all-in-one ETF like you were talking about, the likelihood of them earning the return of the index and not less than the return of that index is significantly higher, as it is with robo-advisors. So if you have a robo-advisory firm, you're like, Andrew, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, cool, fair enough. You can open an account with CI Direct Investing or with Wealthsimple, basically robo-advisory firms that will build you a portfolio at a low cost. You add money every month to your TFSA or your RRSP. And ironically, you are going to outperform most of the sophisticated investors that you know, including the sophisticated investors you know who are in individual ETFs.
So now I'm going to talk about something more personal. And I realize I could sound foolish here, but it's okay because I think there's a lot to learn from it. So over the last couple of years, I was investing in BlackRock's one-stop fund, XEQT, so globally diversified across worldwide stocks. And then I changed things up a bit. Then I started to invest in an ETF that would put money to work in all stocks around the world, ex-Canada. And this one was from BlackRock called XAW. And the reason I started doing that was, Andrew, I'm going to be honest, like I am somebody who is very curious. I in fact like to open up financial statements of companies. I like to track their financial metrics, but I only do this for companies in Canada. I don't mess around with US or companies beyond North America. And I keep telling myself this, I do it because I enjoy it. But one thing I'm realizing is that it takes so much time, yet I still do it. And believe me, I understand the evidence that you have really eloquently shared with us today on why thinking long-term, diversifying, and using one-stop shop funds works. But why is it so hard for us to follow that? Like I like to think that, and I know the reason I'm doing it. One is I enjoy it, but two, I think that in Canada, I can maybe pick the right companies. And I know that sounds so foolish, so you can slice and dice me here. But why is it so difficult for us to follow the evidence?
John Bogle, who was the founder of Vanguard, I think he put it best when he said, hope springs eternal. So we know the odds of winning in a casino. We know those odds are not good. But why are casinos around the world packed? It's much like lottery winning. We know the odds of us winning are horrible. I joke and say a lottery is just a tax for people who are bad with math and probability.
Yeah.
Yet, around the world, hope always springs eternal. So we know when we look at peer-reviewed evidence on stock picking, and now you have to think about not this year, 5 years, think of your lifetime. So over your lifetime, what are your odds of matching the Canadian stock market index or beating it with your individual stocks? And the peer-reviewed evidence suggests that over 30 to 50 years, almost zero.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I could just go to Spiva, right? Like the evidence that they kind of publish every year on how, I guess, people who are actively managing their money, how do they compare to the benchmarks? And the longer you extend that horizon, like I know the odds are bad, yet I still do it. But I may reconsider after everything you say today. Andrew, no, seriously, it's been a
Hey,
struggle
wait,
for
yeah,
me.
yeah.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
hobbies cost a lot of hobbies cost money,
I
right?
know. I
A
know.
lot of hobbies cost money, and if you
I know.
enjoy it and it's your hobby,
Yeah.
it might not cost you money. It likely will. It
Hmm.
likely will. So it's just a hobby that you will be spending money on, likely.
Yeah.
Right? And if you enjoy
Yeah.
it, you enjoy it.
Okay.
The rest of your portfolio is globally diversified.
Yeah.
You're not a machine. And
Yeah.
if this is the thing that you enjoy, fair enough, right?
All right. All right. I appreciate that. Now, for people who don't want to do this themselves, do you have like a set of 3 or 4 questions that are imperative for us to ask a financial advisor to make sure that we're going to get a good service and that the fit will be right?
There's only a small percentage of financial advisors who will actually build you a low cost portfolio of index funds or ETFs. And none of them work at the major institutions like Canada's banks or Canada's investment firms. Those that do exist tend to have really high um, income points. So, not necessarily income, but high asset thresholds. And so, um, Tullett Matthews and Associates is one. PWL Capital is another one.
Hmm.
Kelson Financial is another one. But if
Hmm.
you're just starting to invest,
Hmm.
one of those firms, however great they are, might require you to have a minimum of 500,000 just to open an account. So don't quote me on that. In some cases, somebody who
Hmm.
actually
Hmm.
works for Kelson might say, "Wait, Andrew, no, our limit is 250.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah,
not
no worries.
500. You just cost us some clients."
Yeah.
Right? My apologies. But generally speaking, high entry points, and so you're really not going to find them. But back to that point, the 3 questions that you would ask is: do you build exclusively a portfolio with index funds or ETFs? Do you never speculate? So you never think about the economy and try to adjust the portfolio based on where you think the economic future is going to be, or the stocks are going to perform, or a specific index is going to perform. And 3, do you get paid any commissions for the products? You don't want them to be paid any commissions on these products. The universe of such financial advisors is so small, and generally you need such a high asset base to get invested with them, that it's something that most new investors won't have access to. However, what's super cool
Mhm.
is that the robo advisory firms in Canada have really nicely bridged this gap. So they've created something that fulfills a need that people have needed for decades in Canada, but just didn't exist. So, if you open an account with Wealthsimple
Mhm.
and you go with a robo advisor or CI Direct Investing, there are several different robo advisory firms in Canada. You
Mhm.
could just go online and do a search. I know Money Sense rates them every year or so. They write an article that they publish an article that rates them. They're all pretty much the same as I see it. You want to make sure that if you do have a robo advisory firm, I know what some of them do is they'll actually have this premium model where they do a little bit of speculating. We don't want that,
Okay.
because the odds are that speculation will just cost you money
Hmm.
overall. You'll earn less money, you'll end up with less wealth. So keep it really, really simple and say
Okay.
you don't speculate, right? You rebalance it based on a simple allocation.
Hmm.
And generally, those robo advisors are pretty good at that.
Okay. Now, just to segue to relationships and purpose, I do sympathize with a lot of my colleagues, and I can tell you why. So I'm a physician. A lot of people listening to this podcast are physicians. There's a long, long road of training before we actually start earning in the real world, making money and supporting our families. And I can tell you because of that, Andrew, like the conversations I've had is we think in the early stages, at least of our careers, we think so much about accumulating wealth, paying off that student debt. And I find that at times when I look at that four-legged stool, so much attention, at least in those early years, goes to that leg of financial security. But as time goes on, I realize it's possible to have meaningful change. But I'm wondering if can you give us some some actionable steps to, how do we stop thinking about money so much? I know we need a certain amount to be happy and content, but how do we stop thinking so much about money and moving on to these other important legs? Like what are some actionable steps that we can take today to do that?
I think it's anything. It's embracing the behavioral science on this. And so, as a physician, you know, you know one of the aspects, of course, to good healthy living is exercise and a healthy diet. And there are temptations to eat the whatever the eat the pies and drink the Coca-Cola and lots of it might be alcohol or whatever it is. You've got these temptations, and those things kind of feel good initially, to succumb to those temptations. Like exercising, you think it feels better to sit on the couch with the remote control than it does to go out and play some tennis with your friends. Like getting up takes the effort, but you know about these things on a scientific level. You know what it is that will actually enhance your health overall. And it is getting the exercise and it is eating the balanced diet. Now you just have to take that same mindset because as a physician, you're science based. So now be science based. Be science based with respect to your income and your allocation of that income. So don't be afraid to spend money on, for example, experiences. Because as people of science, you also know that life is like a dark hourglass. Nobody can see how much sand they have in it. It
Mhm.
gets tipped at
Mhm.
birth. So don't live a life whereby you're expecting to at some point in the future really begin living and enjoying it. Try to think far more balanced using science and that absolute reality that any day could be your last. So balancing it out is the most important thing.
Let me just kind of pivot to relationships. You've mentioned in your work that relationships are so important. Dan Buettner, in his work on the blue zones, which you also reference in Balance, talks about the same thing. Why are relationships so important? I think it's sometimes something we take a bit for granted, but why?
I mean, it seems to be that we've always needed to rely on each other emotionally, sometimes quite directly and physically. It's what's helped our species thrive. It's cooperation. And then there's that need and desire that we have to feel loved and to give love. And on a cellular level, we are actually rewarded for having close relationships with other people where we give of our love and receive of our love. If you want to kill somebody, isolate them, put them in solitary confinement for years. You can feed them all you want. You can give them a treadmill. You can give them intellectual stuff to read.
Hmm.
They are not going to live as long as that farmer in Costa Rica who is surrounded by his or her family members that
Hmm.
are connecting. And I think that's probably part of it. And I could ask you too, in terms of your actual theories on it,
Hmm.
in terms of like what and how does it affect us on a cellular level. I don't know if any of us really know the answer to that, but it does affect us on that cellular level. So to ignore that part of the science is we do so at our peril.
Now, any thoughts on meaningful relationships and connecting with people in a meaningful way in a social media driven world. Like maybe I can just tell a quick story, Andrew. So, um, so everyone, like Andrew and I actually tried to record this podcast 2 days ago. We ran into some technical issues, and Andrew, my sense is that you are. I love your posts on LinkedIn, but my sense is you don't spend all of your time on social media, because when we were trying to solve these technical issues, I was telling you, well, maybe you can download this app, and then you were like, well, I don't really download apps. So, any thoughts on? Because I feel like social media is everywhere. I'm worried for young children, to be honest, very worried. And I find that social media forces us to compare ourselves to one another. But any advice for navigating this world that seems to be so social media driven and just focusing on quality, meaningful relationships?
Well, social media is a great tool. So I'm the first person to say, yeah, I do spend time conversing with people, organizing things with people on social media. But I think one thing that is so important is to actually make things happen. So, okay, use social media to connect with people, not necessarily online, but in person, because that's what we actually need. So I'm just this morning, I'm texting some friends. We're all on WhatsApp, we're on a group chat, and we're having this back and forth. I should probably back this up. We're having a back and forth, and I'm realizing these are a couple of guys that I haven't seen in a decade. One of them at the time was living in Switzerland. The other guy was living in Bulgaria. And I haven't seen them for over a decade. And I really love these guys. Like, these guys are fantastic. And we're having this chat back and forth on WhatsApp, which is awesome. So love that. But that's here in terms of like overall satisfaction. I want here. And I know that time and life can be short. And so I said to these guys, let's meet in Bulgaria. Let's actually make a plan to do this. So my wife calls me an activator. So I'll chat with people on social media. But if it's someone that I really want to be connected with, I will work really, really hard to make sure that we end up meeting together and enjoying something and having an actual experience from which we're going to build memories. Because you don't build memories from interacting with people on social media. You just don't. Like, years from now in a campfire story, you're never going to go, man, wasn't that awesome when you sent that really cool text? And then, we were on social media and you mooned me, and oh man, that was so much fun. That doesn't happen, right? That doesn't happen. But it's the stuff that when you're actually you're using it to connect with real people. I've done instances where, and again, it's a great tool. Social media is a great tool. There was a woman who I went to university with, who I hadn't seen in 25 years. And I posted something on Facebook that I was in Mulaje, Mexico. And she and her husband, who I had never met, I hadn't seen her in a couple of decades. They were down in Malacca on the Pacific coast, which is about 2.5 hours from me. And they made some note. She sort of types in, hey, I'm in Malacca. You want to see my pictures? And I said, I'd love to see your pictures. But more than that, I want to see you. How are we going to make this happen? And so for me, I mean, Pelly, my wife, just say, you're a total activator. But I think that I have lots of faults for sure. But I think that's probably one of my best attributes, is like, let's make it happen. Like a real connected meeting.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. You know what? You need people in your life like that, Andrew. So I think the people who have you in your life, that's great. I want to talk. So you and your wife, Pele, you guys have spent a lot of time abroad. Did I pronounce her name okay there? I feel like I'm just not getting it, but
yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah, so you guys have spent a lot of you guys have spent so much time abroad, and I'm curious, like, what has that done for you guys? And then any advice for people who are thinking, well, maybe I'm not going to spend all my life in Canada or the US or wherever you may be. For people who are thinking about moving abroad, like, what are the reasons one may want to do that? I know some of the reasons people think are financial, but it's probably much more than that. I'd love your take on it.
So with the travel itself, and I think many of your listeners have traveled, and when you start asking people what they get out of it, okay, there's the element of, there's the relaxation, but for that, I would call the relaxation sort of a vacation. But real travel is when you start immersing yourself in a different country, different culture, and really having a good look around and asking people questions. And that's the part of travel that I love. That's the part
Hmm.
of going abroad and being abroad that I love, because the more I learn about life and other people's cultures and the way people think, the more I realize I don't know. And I'm just so excited to learn and meet different people and hear their stories and make stuff happen. So, down the street here, 2 blocks from here, there's this van. The door was open. I went there to find that it was a couple of Spaniards
Hmm.
in a Sprinter van with Argentinian plates. And I started chatting with them and I said, "Do you guys like pizza? Come on over tonight. I will get some pizza." There's this outside wood oven place outside of a building. This guy makes the best pizza in town. And
Wow.
we had these 2 Spaniards that we invited over. We sat around the table and I'm like, "Tell me about this. How long have you guys been traveling through South America and Central America in this van?" To me, that's the richest thing when we can learn from others. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you're learning in Central America or South America
Uh-huh.
from some Spaniards in a van. It can be people in your own community,
Hmm.
and getting out and asking them questions can just be so enriching. Now, like to your point, there's another aspect that many people do like. It's the idea of, some call it geographical arbitrage,
Hmm.
where you could work earning income that is Canadian sourced,
Hmm.
for example. And there are a lot of people that do this, like a lot of digital nomads. So
Hmm.
they might earn Canadian sourced income
Hmm.
online. They might work for a company or they might be working for themselves. And they're in Medellin, Colombia. So Colombia is one place that has accepted digital visas, digital
Hmm.
nomad visas. So
Hmm.
young people working online, they have workspaces for them. That's an opportunity for them to, one, travel, see more of the world, enrich themselves in ways that I was just describing, and coming ahead financially as well, because Colombia is far cheaper than Canada. So it allows them also to put money in the bank. But I don't think that if somebody says to me, "I want to move abroad because of the financial
Hmm.
implications
Hmm.
purely," I would say that that in itself could be quite wrongheaded. So it needs to be more than just that. That's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, beautiful story about the Spaniards in the van. And can I just say, Andrew, like for you to invite them over for pizza, like that's a very nice act by you. You're being generous, and in fact, I think you're giving. So maybe I can just take that situation and say, because you talk a lot about giving, the importance of giving, and also you talk about pro-social giving. So kind of with your own eyes, kind of seeing the impact of you giving. Um, a quick note on giving, Andrew? Like, why is this important? And then for those of us who want to give, uh, what are easy ways for us at home to engage in pro social giving for us to see the impact of our efforts as well?
Yeah, that second question is going to be a tough one, um, because we really have to keep our eyes open for opportunities to give. And
Hmm.
back to the, why give and what is pro-social giving. We're all familiar with giving money. You might give money to the United Way, and research does suggest that enhances life satisfaction. That we actually feel better about ourselves when we help other people and
Hmm.
when we give. However, to really enhance that, because not everybody's going to feel that. To really enhance that, we need to see the results of our help, the results of our giving. So if you're seeing that your neighbor is struggling outside with a wall that they're holding up, and you run out there and you help them, it feels good to actually help them and to see that the two of you have put that wall together or held that wall up. And it can be much the same when you're giving to a financial or giving to a charitable organization like a home building project, like Habitat for Humanity. These
Hmm.
are the kinds of things that allow us to see the results of the help that we are giving. And so, if at all possible, those are the kinds of opportunities that we need to keep our eyes open for.
I love it. I love it. Believe it or not, Andrew, I only have like a couple more questions, and it looks like a beautiful day in Boquete. So I want you to enjoy your day as well. Um, Purpose. I find like some people just tell me, "Oh, geez, here's another day. It's the same old thing. Why? Why am I doing this?" I want to ask you, Andrew, like what is your purpose? And when did you know you found your purpose? And some people say when you find your purpose, you kind of feel different. And when you found your purpose, did you feel any different? I just love your take.
I think a lot of people put too much pressure on themselves with respect to a purpose, like it's got to be
Mm-hmm.
some life altering thing, world saving thing, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. And I know a lot of people talk about purpose, and it's important. It's a thing that gets you up in the morning. But I would say, okay, so you've got a job and you don't enjoy it. It's okay. You don't necessarily have to quit that job. You can, if you choose, and find something that you'd be much better suited to in terms of your
Mm-hmm.
personality and your enjoyment. Or you can find something on the side that may be like just some kind of hobby, and it can give your life purpose in a different capacity. So I have a friend, he grows garlic. It can be really small. He had his regular job, but he's really passionate about growing garlic. So he's got all these garlic beds that he's
Yeah,
built in his
yeah.
back and on the side. And when I go to his house, I mean, I don't share the passion for garlic, but I go there and I have so much joy listening to him passionately go on about these garlic beds. So for him, he could have a mundane job, but he's got this hobby that he's super excited about. And like I said before, that sense of purpose doesn't have to be anything that's life changing.
Yeah.
And the sense of purpose can change all the time too. So, you can have this for a little while, then you can decide you're going to set a goal and
Mm-hmm.
you're going to achieve some kind of different goal. It could be a physical goal that gives you a
Mm-hmm.
sense of
Mm-hmm.
purpose as well. It could be I want to get in better shape. Literally, it could be I want to get in better shape, and then set a smart goal associated with it. So one that's measurable, one that's time oriented. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just this vague thing. And it becomes a
Mm-hmm.
little side mission. And it too can give you purpose, because a lot of people, you could end up, it's really, really glib of me to say, oh, if you have a job you don't like, just quit, do something else. Well, yeah, you can, if that is something that is possible for you. But in some cases, that's extremely difficult. So then finding that joy and that purpose somewhere else, I think can end up giving you that carryover and lifting your life.
This reminds me of a situation. Well, not a situation, but we go to Picton once a year. My wife and my two boys, and every time we go to Picton, there is this little house in the countryside, and they are known for their butter tarts. I can't remember the name of the place off the top of my head, but we've stopped there every year, and it's an honor system. So they just keep loading up this shack with butter tarts, and if you want to take a box, you just drop like $20. Maybe you can leave a tip, and you just walk out with your box. There's nobody there. One day I met the owner and I started talking to him. I was like, how long have you been doing this? Why are you so passionate about butter tarts? And he kind of told me his story and how like he literally lives, Andrew, to just make the best butter tarts and just bring them to the world. Like that's what makes this guy tick. And then I met somebody in his family, and this individual told me like he literally like spends all his waking hours making butter tarts. So speaking about purpose, and if you're ever in Picton, just Google butter tarts in Picton. You got to go check it out. Andrew, my last question for you is like, what is the most valuable lesson that you have learned in your life?
Talk less, listen more.
Short and sweet. I love it. I love it. Andrew, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time. For somebody like you, I have to say this to everybody, somebody like you who has done so well and impacted so many people, for you to just be so willing to give your time like this, I think it just speaks volumes about the type of person you are. Thank you for making the time and educating us and sharing your story.
Oh, that's so kind of you. Thank you.
Let me take a second to offer my perspective on relationships. When I follow the work of people like Andrew Hallam and Dan Buettner, it really seems like the most important element of a successful life, a happy and rewarding life, is our relationships, the people who we spend time with. When I look back at my life, I was never the most popular kid, but I was always very fortunate to have a number of good quality friends. These are people that I could count on one hand. And when I look at this is very different than my eating habits as a student. At that time, it was quantity over quality, but when it comes to relationships, I'm a big believer that it's quality over quantity. I would much rather have 5 friends that I can count on one hand, but I really do believe that these friends would fly across the country for me if I was ever going through a difficult time. Like, to me, those 5 friendships are so much more important than having hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram. These are the types of relationships where you build bonds, you build a lot of memories to last a lifetime. The second thing about relationships is that I think a lot of good things happen when you are staying under the same roof. So let me back it up a second. In 2023, Seema, myself, and our boys, and also Seema's mother, we were doing a road trip down the coast of California, started in San Francisco, made our way down to San Diego. And we were booking our accommodations, and Seema said, you know what, I'm going to take care of this. I'm going to find us a cool place to stay in Los Angeles. And I said, oh, hold on. Like, your cousin Jay is in Los Angeles, so let's just stay with Jay and his wife, Patricia Chang. I was like, this is going to be amazing. The families will be able to connect. And Seema said, you know what, that's a wonderful idea. And of course, Jay Acharya, her cousin, and his wife, Patricia Chang, like, they welcomed us in with open arms. They really wanted us to stay with them. And guys, I'm so glad we did that, because it was a chance for our families to connect. It was, more importantly, a chance for our boys, Rohan and Zion, to meet their children. And there was a lot of love in that moment, and a lot of memories were created, bonds were strengthened, and 3 months later, when they came to visit us in Toronto, it was almost like no time had passed. The kids just hit it off right away. And I'm telling you guys, like, from my experience, if you have an opportunity to host people, whether it's family or friends, have them stay over, because true bonds, true memories, those to last a lifetime, often happen when you are staying under the same roof. So guys, thank you as always for listening and for joining in. We'll see you in a few weeks. Until next time, stay well, stay savvy.